July 19th, 1940, 7 in the evening. In the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, Adolf Hitler stands before the Reichstag, preparing to speak words that will determine whether Europe faces years more of war or an unexpected peace. 6 weeks earlier, France surrendered. Britain's army evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all its heavy equipment. Now Britain stands alone, no army on the continent, no major allies, facing the most powerful military machine ever assembled in Europe. Logic says they should negotiate. Military reality says they must. Every calculation suggests Churchill will see reason. But what Hitler says tonight, and what his generals say after Churchill's response, will reveal something profound about why some wars cannot end, even when one side has already won. The Kroll Opera House is packed, every Reichstag deputy present, every uniform pressed to perfection. Newsreel cameras positioned to capture history. Outside, Berliners gather around radios, confident they're about to hear the announcement of Britain's surrender terms. Hitler's voice, when he begins, carries none of his usual rage. He speaks almost reasonably, like a man offering generous terms to a beaten opponent. He recounts Germany's victories. Poland in weeks, Denmark and Norway secured, Holland and Belgium overrun, France, proud France, defeated in 6 weeks. He lingers on these facts, building his case like a prosecutor presenting evidence no jury could ignore. Then, nearly 90 minutes into the speech, he arrives at the moment everyone is waiting for. "In this hour," he says, his voice dropping, "I feel compelled by conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain. I consider myself in a position to make this appeal since I am not the vanquished begging favors, but the victor speaking in the name of reason." In London, Foreign Office staff gather around wireless sets, translating in real time. At 10 Downing Street, Churchill listens, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. He's heard rumors of this speech for days. Now it's happening. Hitler continues, "I can see no reason why this war must go on." Behind him, the assembled officers and officials remain motionless. Grand Admiral Raeder sits rigid, knowing his navy cannot invade Britain without air supremacy. General Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, has maps back at OKW headquarters showing the problems, the English Channel, the Royal Navy, the logistical nightmare of amphibious assault. They want Churchill to accept. God, how they want him to accept. "Mr. Churchill," Hitler says, his voice hardening slightly, "may perhaps regard this statement of mine as a sign of weakness or of cowardice. If he does, I must bear with him this display of his stupidity or his malice." The deputies applaud. The cameras capture it all. Broadcast live across Europe, the speech reaches millions. In occupied Paris, where French citizens listen with complicated emotions. In neutral Sweden, where diplomats pass every word. In Rome, where Mussolini waits to see if his German ally will rob him of the glory of participating in Britain's defeat. But most importantly, it reaches Britain. At the BBC, the decision is made immediately. They will not broadcast Hitler's speech. British citizens will not hear their enemy's reasonable offer in his own voice. Instead, they'll hear their own leader's response. Churchill doesn't wait for official translation. Within an hour, he has the gist. Within 2 hours, he's drafting a response. Within 3 hours, Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax is writing a formal rejection. The answer, Churchill makes clear, will be no. Not "let's discuss terms," not "let's open negotiations." Simply no. July 22nd arrives. 3 days after Hitler's speech, the British government's official response comes not through diplomatic channels, but through BBC radio. A government spokesman reads a statement so blunt it shocks neutral observers. "We shall not stop fighting until freedom is secure." That's it. No counteroffer, no conditions, no acknowledgement that Hitler even made a reasonable point worth considering. In Berlin, the reaction is not immediate rage. It's something more dangerous. disbelief. July 23rd. Morning. The Reich Chancellery. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder arrives for a conference he wishes he didn't have to attend. He's 64 years old, a career naval officer who understands something his army colleagues don't. The English Channel is not just water. It's a moat defended by the world's most powerful navy. In the conference room, maps cover every table. Charts showing tides, moon phases, weather patterns. Calculations of how many barges would be needed to transport the first wave. Estimates of casualties. All of it theoretical until 3 days ago. Now, suddenly, desperately relevant. General Franz Halder enters, carrying files. At 56, he's methodical, precise, a staff officer's staff officer. He's been planning Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, since June, but planning is an intellectual exercise. A contingency, something that wouldn't actually be necessary, because surely the British would negotiate. They said no, Halder says quietly to Raeder, as if still processing the information. I heard. Not, let's talk about terms. Not, perhaps we can find common ground. Just no. Raeder opens his briefcase, removes a document. The Kriegsmarine cannot guarantee safe passage across the Channel, not against the Royal Navy. I need to be clear about this before the Führer arrives. The Army needs 40 divisions in the first wave, Halder responds. 40 divisions means 260,000 men, 60,000 vehicles, 30,000 horses. That requires 1,122 barges, 471 tugs, 155 transport ships. Where will we get them? How will we protect them? They're not arguing with each other. They're rehearsing arguments for Hitler, testing logic that might penetrate his certainty that Churchill will crack. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring arrives late, uniform immaculate, confidence unshaken. At 47, he's the Luftwaffe's commander, Germany's second most powerful man, and the only person in the room who genuinely believes invasion might not be necessary. The Luftwaffe can solve this, he announces before anyone asks. Give me 4 weeks of good weather. We'll destroy the RAF, bomb their ports, break their will. Churchill won't last once London is burning. Raeder's expression doesn't change. And if he does last, then we invade with air superiority. Simple. Nothing about amphibious assault is simple. Raeder says, voice tight. The Royal Navy has 50 destroyers in home waters. We have none in the Channel. We have the Luftwaffe, Göring interrupts. Ships are just targets. Hitler enters. Everyone stands. Hitler waves them down impatiently, moves to the maps, stares at the English Channel like it's a personal insult. Churchill rejected us, he says. Not a question, a statement of fact that still seems to puzzle him. Yes, my Führer, Halder confirms. He cannot win. He knows this. His army left its equipment at Dunkirk. The French are defeated. The Americans are neutral. The Soviets are our partners through the Non-Aggression Pact. There is no rational path to British victory. Silence. And yet he said no. More silence. Because what response exists? Churchill's rejection doesn't make military sense, doesn't follow the logic of power and capability. It's emotion disguised as strategy, stubbornness masquerading as courage. Or perhaps, though no one in this room can quite grasp it, it's something else entirely. A refusal to accept that calculations matter more than principles, that power determines right, that defeat is inevitable simply because someone stronger says it is. Hitler turns to Göring. How quickly can the Luftwaffe establish air superiority? 4 weeks, my Führer. Perhaps less if weather cooperates. And then? Göring's confidence falters slightly. And then? We can support invasion or continue bombing until Churchill's government falls. Which will happen first? Göring doesn't answer immediately. Finally, the British people may lose their resolve before their government does. Hitler turns to Raeder. Can the Navy conduct the invasion? Under certain conditions, my Führer. If and this is absolutely critical, if the Luftwaffe achieves complete air superiority, if we have absolute control of the channel, if weather holds, if the Royal Navy doesn't contest the crossing with everything they have, which they will. You're saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's extraordinarily risky. The British destroyed the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir 3 weeks ago, specifically to prevent those ships from potentially falling into our hands. They killed 1,300 French sailors, their own allies, to maintain naval supremacy. They will defend their home waters with everything available. Hitler walks to the window. Below, Berlin goes about its business. The war feels distant here, academic, victory parades and newspaper headlines, not the grind of actual combat. We gave them a way out, Hitler says, voice quieter now. Generous terms, their empire intact, their navy unthreatened. All they had to do was acknowledge reality. Churchill doesn't accept reality, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop offers. He's been silent until now, nursing the diplomatic humiliation of his back-channel peace feelers being ignored. He's a romantic, a relic. He thinks this is 1805, that Britain can fight Napoleon alone and win through will and determination. Can they? Hitler asks. The question hangs. No, Ribbentrop says firmly. They cannot. But Churchill may not realize that until we've destroyed his air force, bombed his cities, and made the cost unmistakably clear. Hitler returns to the maps. His finger traces the French coast, then moves across the Channel to England. 40 kilometers at the narrowest point. 300 years ago, this would have been nothing. Sail across, land armies, fight. But now, with submarines and destroyers and dive bombers and radar stations, those 40 kilometers might as well be 4,000. We proceed with Sea Lion preparations, Hitler orders. Radar, you will assemble the necessary vessels. Halder, finalize invasion plans. Göring, the Luftwaffe will begin operations to destroy the RAF. We'll set a preliminary invasion date of mid-September, dependent on air superiority being achieved. The generals exchange glances. Orders given, paths set. But underneath the military precision, a current of doubt. Because Churchill said no. Because logic should have prevailed, and didn't. Because suddenly the summer of 1940, the summer of Germany's greatest victories, doesn't feel quite as certain anymore. August 1st, 1940. Hitler issues Directive Number 17. In order to establish conditions favorable to the final conquest of England, I intend to intensify air and naval warfare against the English homeland. Final conquest, as if it's inevitable, as if Churchill's refusal was merely a delay, not an actual answer. The Luftwaffe begins operations, attacks on channel shipping first, then radar stations, then RAF airfields. Göring's confidence remains absolute. 4 weeks, he'd promised, maybe less. But in the Chancellery, in private conversations behind closed doors, doubt metastasizes. General Halder writes in his diary, entries growing darker. The tasks of the Navy and Army in Operation Sea Lion have not been coordinated. The Navy is full of misgivings. Nothing decisive can be expected from this operation. Radar submits report after report, each more pessimistic than the last. The barges are assembled, yes, but they're river craft, not designed for open sea. A storm, any storm, would devastate them, and the British know this. RAF bombers hit the invasion fleet assembly points nightly. Each barge destroyed is one, less vessel available. Meanwhile, above southern England, the air war intensifies. The Luftwaffe loses aircraft faster than expected. Not catastrophically, but steadily. The RAF should be breaking, but isn't. British pilots keep rising to meet each attack, and still Churchill refuses to negotiate. August 20th. Hitler speaks again, this time in a Reich Chancellery meeting. No cameras, no public record, just his inner circle. Why won't he bend? Hitler asks. And for the first time, there's genuine frustration rather than rhetorical flourish. We've bombed his airfields, we've sunk his ships, we've demonstrated absolute superiority. What does he think he can accomplish? No one has an answer. Because to answer honestly that perhaps Churchill doesn't care about calculations, that perhaps British determination isn't rational, that perhaps some nations refuse to surrender no matter the cost, would be to admit that Germany's entire strategic framework might be flawed. Göring tries to maintain optimism. The RAF is weakening. Every day we destroy more aircraft than they can replace. And yet they keep fighting, Hitler says. Not for much longer. But Göring's confidence is beginning to sound hollow. His pilots report increasing resistance, not decreasing. British radar continues to function. RAF fighters appear when they shouldn't, where they shouldn't, in numbers that shouldn't be possible, if the Luftwaffe's victory claims are accurate. August turns to September. The preliminary invasion date of September 15th approaches. Weather reports look increasingly unfavorable. The Royal Navy repositions forces, ready to contest any crossing attempt with overwhelming force. In a meeting on September 7th, Hitler makes a decision. If the British won't negotiate, if the RAF won't break, if invasion remains too risky, then a different kind of pressure is needed. We shift targeting, he announces, from military to civilian, from airfields to cities, from the RAF to London itself. Göring approves enthusiastically. Raeder and Halder say nothing. This isn't military strategy anymore. It's psychological warfare, an attempt to break civilian morale since military force hasn't achieved quick victory. If Churchill won't listen to reason, Hitler says, perhaps the British people will. Perhaps when London is burning, when thousands are dying, when the cost becomes unbearable, they'll demand new leadership. Someone rational. Someone willing to accept the inevitable. The Blitz begins. On September 7th, 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, attack London. The docks burn. The East End burns. Over 400 civilians die that first night, and Churchill still says no. September 15th, the scheduled invasion date. Instead of landing craft crossing the Channel, the Luftwaffe launches its largest daylight attack on London. The RAF meets them in force. By day's end, the Germans have lost 60 aircraft, far more than they can sustain. 2 days later, Hitler postpones Sea Lion indefinitely. Not cancelled, postponed. Because cancelling would be admitting failure, admitting that Churchill's defiance actually worked, that stubbornness somehow trumped overwhelming military superiority. In Berlin's inner circles, the mood shifts from confidence to frustration to something darker, resentment. They had offered peace. They had offered generous terms. They had given Britain every opportunity to avoid destruction. And Churchill chose destruction. October 1940. The Blitz continues. London burns nightly. Other cities, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, suffer devastating attacks. Thousands die. But the British government doesn't fall. Churchill doesn't resign. Parliament doesn't demand negotiations. If anything, British resolve hardens. In Berlin, the generals who planned Sea Lion begin planning something else, Operation Barbarossa. If Britain won't surrender, if invasion is impossible, if the war in the West can't be won quickly, then perhaps the solution lies east. Perhaps the Soviet Union, with its vast resources and perceived military weakness, offers an easier path to ultimate victory. It's madness, of course. Fighting a two-front war, the nightmare that destroyed Germany in the last war. But what choice remains? Britain won't negotiate. America might eventually enter the war. Time favors Germany's enemies, not Germany. So the logic goes. Strike the Soviet Union before Britain can recover. Win a quick victory in the East. Then, with Russian resources secured, return to finish Britain. It's a gamble born of frustration. A strategic pivot made necessary because Churchill said no and meant it. In November, as winter approaches and weather makes invasion truly impossible, Hitler finally, quietly, acknowledges what his generals knew months earlier. Sea Lion won't happen. Not in 1940, not in 1941, probably never. Raeder, in his private correspondence, writes with barely concealed relief, "The Kriegsmarine has been spared an operation it could not have executed successfully." But there's no triumph in his words, only exhaustion. Halder's diary entries grow philosophical. The English are stubborn. One must respect that, even as one regrets the unnecessary prolongation of the war. Goering blames the Navy blames the Luftwaffe. Both blame the weather, the unexpected strength of the RAF, the irrationality of British leadership. No one blames the fundamental assumption that military superiority automatically translates to political surrender, that calculations matter more than will, that power alone determines outcomes. Years later, after everything collapsed, after Germany lay in ruins, after the war, Germany thought it had won in July 1940, instead consumed everything. Survivors would be asked, "When did you first doubt victory was certain?" Some would point to Stalingrad or D-Day or other dramatic turning points, but a few, Halder among them, would think back to that summer. When Churchill said no, Halder admitted in the Archives, 1952, 7 years after the war ended. When he rejected our peace offer and we realized we couldn't force him to negotiate. That's when the war changed from a military operation to a test of wills. And in tests of will, calculations don't matter. Only determination does. He paused, remembering. We had the better military, better equipment, better tactics, more victories. On paper, we should have won easily. But Churchill didn't fight on paper. He fought on principle, and we had no weapon effective against that. In the Kroll Opera House on July 19, 1940, Hitler spoke for nearly 2 hours. Most of that speech is forgotten now. The boasting, the historical justifications, the recounting of victories. But one phrase remains, preserved in newsreels and diplomatic archives. I can see no reason why this war must go on. He genuinely couldn't. From his perspective, from any rational military perspective, Britain's position was hopeless. To continue fighting was to choose destruction over negotiation, suffering over settlement, principle over pragmatism. What Hitler and his high command never understood, what their shock and frustration after Churchill's rejection revealed, was that some things matter more than survival, that nations aren't always rational actors, that people sometimes choose to fight, not because they believe they'll win, but because they believe surrender is worse than death. The German High Command spent months after Churchill's rejection trying to force Britain's surrender through military pressure. They planned invasions they never launched. They bombed cities hoping to break morale. They waited for Churchill's government to fall, for British resolve to crack, for logic to finally prevail. It never did. Instead, Britain stood, alone for over a year, outgunned and outmanned. Surviving on will and stubbornness and a refusal to accept that defeat was inevitable simply because someone stronger said it was. In 1940, Grand Admiral Raeder wrote to a colleague, "The British are behaving irrationally. They cannot win, yet they will not surrender. It defies explanation." But perhaps the explanation was simple. Churchill said no, and Britain meant it. And sometimes in history, that has to be enough.